Hello everyone, I'm Scruffy at Scruffy Tales and welcome back to the War Zone. And we're gonna be taking a look at the Ukrainian front line and how Ukraine is holding the line against multiple Russian assaults all along the front line. And we are gonna be relying on maps from the 6th of September, so things may change by the time this thing is uploaded. And also, if you hear something in the background, I have two dogs that are currently playing and not really responding to commands to stop, so just be aware. So here we have a map of the front line and the four areas we will be focusing on. Russia is on the advance in all four regions. Ukraine is doing their best to halt the advance, and they have been somewhat successful. But make no mistake about it, Russia is advancing, or has been advancing for a couple of days at least. It's been static for a day, so maybe Russia has run out of steam. Maybe Ukraine has finally managed to halt the advance altogether. We'll see what happens in the next coming days. And we're gonna be starting out with taking a look at Russia's attempts to reach Terny and the Ukrainian attempts to hold the line. And this is taking place in the northernmost region that we're going to be taking a look at, west of a town called Kreminna. We have Lysychansk highlighted on the map here. So let's take a closer look. So Russia is pushing west from Crimea. They have throughout the year been attacking south in the forests south of Chervona Dibrova. Ukraine has managed to deny Russia any major advances down there in the forests. So now Russia has shifted the focus and launched a sneak attack across the open farmlands north. With the goal of reaching the town of Terny in order to secure a bunch of bridges around Terny that crosses a river. And things progressed rather quickly. In the space of 48 hours, Russia made significant advances. Ukraine also made a counter push. Quite a successful counterattack, to be honest. So in the leftmost map, we have the Russian positions around the end of November. And then at the start of December, we had a big push into Ukrainian territory in the middle map, as you can see. And the day after following that, you had even more advances in the south. And Ukraine was quick to launch a counterattack in the north. Highlighted with the two blue circles. So if we take a closer look at the topmost blue circle, this is where Ukraine made a counterattack, and the blue circle is where Ukraine needs to focus their defenses, basically, in order to stop you Russians from making any headway in this area. And the Russians, they want to get into this valley, and there's 3 access points to the valley itself. And Ukraine has managed to push Russia more or less out of the valley after Russia had actually pushed into the valley. And key in holding the valley for the Ukrainians will be the patch of woods, the forest located within the blue circle. As you can see, if the Russians want to gain access to the valley and bypass Ukrainian defenses, they need to push through that forest. So if Ukraine just manages to hold that forest, then Russia can't really access the valley, unless they manage to push in the north, but that's a more difficult task since they have to follow a windbreak and then cross some farmland in order to reach it. So it's more than likely that Russia will try and push into the valley in the two access points in the south, and Ukraine has the upper hand. Holding that forest gives Ukraine the upper hand. They can set up defenses, they have the cover, and they can prepare ambushes as the Russians are advancing towards them. So I think after that big push that Ukraine put in to counter the initial Russian assault, I think by now this part of the battlefield is securely in Ukrainian hands, and Russia won't be able to gain access to the northernmost valley. Thank God. Now, moving on to the other circle in the south. This is the second important location for the Ukrainians to hold. Again, a valley. Russia has two access points to it, and they have pushed into this valley from the east and are secure in the valley. And they've also pushed in from the south, and they are now in a stretch of woods located within the blue circle. And if the Russians manage to establish a foothold in this location, they can then begin to launch attacks into the forest that is covering the entire valley. And if they get into that forest, it becomes more of an even fight. So if Ukraine can hold the blue dotted line at the end of the blue arrow, then Russia will not be able to exploit the valley. They can't push in, they can't advance. So Ukraine needs to hold the open ground, they need to hold the windbreak, and then Russia will be stuck. Russia will probably make a massive effort to gain access to this forest and this valley, because this is their best chance of making headway towards Terny. So I think we will see a lot of fighting going on here in the coming days. And if Ukraine can hold the line, as I've pointed out, then they have basically managed to put a full stop to Russian advance in this area. And that might actually be what's going on, since nothing has happened on the front line, on the maps at least, over the last couple of days. So if Ukraine can prevent Russia from reaching the forest, the Russian advance comes to a full stop. Russia has a couple of other options, moving in this claw-like valley north of this location, of the north of the blue circle. There are two access points into that valley, but they're trickier. One in the north, as you can see, is via a windbreak. And then you have the option of trying to cross the road, trying to cross the farmland, and that way gain access to the valley. And both these options favor the Ukrainian defenders. And then in the far south, they can follow a windbreak into another valley, also forested. And this, you can follow a road into it and stuff like that. But they have not reached that valley yet. Ukraine is in control of the fields and the windbreaks between the Russian positions and that valley, so that will be a difficult fight for Russia as well. So if Ukraine focuses on holding the valley in the middle and that forest, that small area where we can between the red line, between the Russian controlled area and between the blue dotted line, where the Ukrainians are holding on, if they can hold that line and deny Russia to gain access to the forest and the valley, then the Russian advance will go nowhere. And like when the same thing goes for the blue circle in the north, if Ukraine can hold that forest, then Russia cannot gain access to the valley. And they need these valleys to avoid maneuvering out on the open fields, on the farmland where they are easy targets. So these 2 points will deny Russia access to the vital valleys. And if Ukraine holds these 2 points, then this Russian push towards Terny has failed. And now we're moving on to Bakhmut. And the location of Bakhmut is highlighted here with the red circle on the larger map. And I don't think anyone has not heard of Bakhmut at this point. This town that has been the main focus of a lot of the heavy fighting that's been going on in Ukraine for the better part of a year, basically. So on the leftmost map, we see basically the extent of Ukraine's push or Ukraine's attempt to surround Bakhmut and gain access to the hills north and south of Bakhmut. And from there on, Ukraine has been losing territory for a month and a half, 2 months. And Russia has made some gains, reclaiming some territory, mainly north of Bakhmut. They've been climbing up this hill that gives Ukraine very clear lines of sight into the city of Bakhmut. Likewise, the same thing goes for the hill to the south, highlighted with the in the blue areas, by the way. And Russia has been trying to make a push into Klishivka, that town directly south of Bakhmut. And if Russia gains access to Klishivka, then they can begin to climb up on the hill itself. Russia has not been all that successful in this, but it's slow going, and Ukraine is fighting hard to deny Russia to gain access to Klishivka. But like I said, Russia has had the most successes north of Bakhmut, and they are slowly but surely climbing up that hill, taking the fight to the Ukrainians. So what Ukraine needs to do in and around Bakhmut is basically hold these two hills. And if they do that, then they have effectively locked the Russians in place. But at the moment, it feels as if Russia has the upper hand, especially to the north of Bakhmut. And so we'll see what happens. But it's a fight over these two hills. And yeah, Ukraine needs to hold them in order to not be pushed back from Bakhmut and lose their foothold to in and around the city in order to be a threat to the city. Right, that's all we had on Bakhmut. Now we're moving on to Avdiivka, and there's quite a lot going on in and around the city of Avdiivka. Russia is on all-out attack all around the city with multiple points of contact, and Ukraine is fighting hard to keep the Russians away from Ukrainian territory and to hold the Russians at bay. And taking a look at the frontline map, we can see where Avdiivka is located within that small bulge north of Donetsk. And as you can see, Russia has pushed out and almost surrounded the city. And Ukraine is fighting hard to deny the Russian forces to link up and cut off Avdiivka from Ukrainian lines. And we have 4 hotspots in and around Avdiivka that we will be taking a closer look at, indicated by the blue circles, where Ukraine is defending fiercely against Russian attacks. We can also see here that Russia is trying to push in towards the supply lanes, supply routes that Ukraine relies on to get troops, equipment, food, medicine, ammunition, what have you, into the city, so to help the defenders withstand the Russian attacks. And so that's what the Russians are after mainly. They want to push in and cut these yellow dotted lines. Those are the main supply routes leading into the city, helping out with the Ukrainian defense. And as we will take a closer look, we're gonna start off with the small village of Stepove, north of Avdiivka. And Russia is pushing in. They've established a foothold in the small village. Recently, we've seen a lot of footage of Ukrainians moving in with armored vehicles and tanks to engage the Russians hiding in this village, in these buildings. And Ukraine also launched a counterattack towards the bottom of the satellite image, where they pushed the Russians away from that windbreak going north to south, or south to north rather, and if we ask the Russians. So if Ukraine wants to hold Stepove, they basically have 3 points that they need to hold and defend. It is the 2 points, the 2 intersections in the windbreaks south of Stepove, keeping the Russians away from those, and Russia can't advance along the windbreaks, and then they can't threaten the yellow dotted lines leading into Stepove. Those are the supply routes the Ukrainians rely on to get equipment and troops into the village, and they need to keep the Russians away from those. And they also need to keep the Russians away from the white dotted line, a country road leading from Stepove straight south, that would allow the Russians to cut 2 of the vital supply lines leading into Avdiivka, should the Russians get that far. So, and obviously, if they can't let the Russians leave that small section of the village that they are in control, and they need to hold that intersection and those streets and deny the Russians further access into the village. So you have 3 points here in the terrain that are super vital for the Ukrainians, and as long as they hold these 3 dotted blue lines, then the Russians won't be able to make any real headway in and around Stepove, unless they make a concentrated effort further north, which we have seen indications of over the last couple of days, but we'll see how that plays out. It's a bit unclear what's going on north of Stepove at the moment, I feel. Next, we're moving on to the situation around the coke plant. Right, so there are two of the main supply routes leading into Avdiivka goes via the coke plant. The main one directly south, and then a smaller one leading into the coke plant. You can actually see the last stretch of the supply line leading into the coke plant in that small, tiny gray intersection to the left of the factory area. But the yellow dotted line is the big main supply route that Ukraine is relying on, the safest route that is furthest away from Russian interference. So what are the Russians up to in and around the coke plant? We have heard reports that Russians have launched massive assaults towards the coke plant. If it's true, I don't fully understand it, because I don't understand why they want to gain access, or gain access, but why they want to try and contest the Ukrainians within the factory. I understand why they want to harass the Ukrainians, why they want to put pressure on the Ukrainians that are hiding within the factory and using it as a fortification. Because if they apply pressure to the factory, the Ukrainians there can't strike out and interfere with other Russian operations in the area. But I don't think they will try and push in and clear out the Ukrainians not just yet, in a couple of weeks maybe, but not at this point in time. And the reason is math, basically. If the Russians are going to fight the Ukrainians in the factory, they are going to need a 10-to-1 advantage in every given situation. There's no way around it. The Ukrainians have the upper hand. The Ukrainians know all the angles where they can set up ambushes. They know where they can fix booby traps and what have you. They know how to place machine guns to mow down Russians trying to cross open spaces and what have you. Attacking the factory, the coke plant, head on will consume so much manpower and resources for the Russians that it will slow down the entire operation all around. trying to take Avdiivka. So I think it's more likely that they will try and take the water cleaning plant to the right and push in south into the woods and into the suburban area, because as you can see in the woods, traditional thinking, military thinking states that you should strive to have a 3-to-1 advantage in order to win any given firefight. And then in the suburban area, it is urban, but it's not tall buildings, it's not clearing out apartment buildings and stuff like that. It's going house to house. It's an easier form of urban warfare. So instead of 10-to-1 advantage, you only need a 5-to-1 advantage, almost as if you're fighting trench lines and bunkers. So that approach, going through the woods and the suburban area, demands less effort from the Russians, less resources, less manpower in order to be successful. So I think they will be attacking the coke plant to distract the Ukrainians so that they cannot strike out at the Russians. And then the main push will be through the water treatment plant and then into the forest to the south and then into the suburban area. And if you ask me, I think the Russians want to get south of the factory without taking a direct fight within it and cut it off from the rest of Avdiivka, and in so doing also reaching and cutting off the main vital big supply route leading into Avdiivka as they achieve that. So by cutting off the factory from Avdiivka, they also cut off Avdiivka from supplies. And then the Ukrainians in the factory, they're on their own, and Russia can start to push in and in a attritional fight, as it were, within the factory. So Ukraine has the upper hand in the coke plant. Defending the coke plant will be, relatively speaking, easy for the Ukrainians. If the Russians push in towards the coke plant, they will lose troops by the thousands. There's no way around it. So I think that the main push from the Russians will be through the water treatment plant and into the forests and the suburban area. So where does Ukraine need to defend? Well, the water treatment plant. It's being contested at the moment. It's not in Russian control. The Ukrainians are doing the same thing in mounting a fierce resistance and defense in the water treatment plant, as they should, because if Russia gains access to that location, then they can push on and threaten Avdiivka properly from the north. Should Ukrainians lose the water treatment plant, well, then the next line of defense should be south of the open field, in the tree line at the forest, and in the gardens and the streets of the suburban area. So I believe that if Ukraine puts in a lot of effort in building a proper defensive line on the longer blue dotted line that I've marked along the forest and along the suburban area, then the Russian assault will come to a halt, even if they grab the water treatment plant. And if the Russians can't cross this wide open field, then they are forced and more or less funneled into the coke plant, which should be a fortress, a Ukrainian stronghold that will eat away at Russian resources, at Russian manpower, and the Russians will suffer tremendously trying to gain access to the coke plant. So much so that if they launch an attack against the coke plant, I believe that the entire offensive efforts in and around Avdiivka will crumble and the Russians will fail. So, yeah, this is probably the most important location in and around Avdiivka at the moment. If Ukraine can trick the Russians into trying to take the coke plant, then Ukraine can break the Russians in and around Avdiivka. And next stop in and around Avdiivka, we will be taking a look at a location that I don't think all that many people have reported on, and that is Russia's attempt in reaching a hill. So northeast of Avdiivka, we have this big lake, and right next to this big lake, we have a big hill that you can see in the thick blue circle. So what has Russia tried to do over the last couple of days? They've been trying to push south out of Kamyanka through this narrow valley towards a small village. And at the end of that, or not at the end of the valley, but along that valley, they will gain access to the hill that I've marked. And Ukraine has in the same area tried to counter Russians and actually made a counter push up onto a highway, possibly with the intention of threatening Kamyanka, who knows. But in order to stop the Russians from reaching the hill, obviously Ukraine could mount a defense on the hill. That would be very favorable, but I think their best option is to defend the village in the valley and make use of the cover in the buildings and preparing ambushes along the valley, forcing the Russians to push into kill zones as they move along, and that will hopefully drain the Russians of troops and equipment so that they cannot push south and get close to the hill. And getting a better look at that hill that I've marked, you can see here where Ukraine has pushed up on the highway trying to reach Kamyanka, and you can see where Russia has pushed into the valley in their attempt to reach the hill highlighted in the blue circle. And here you can see why this hill is important. If Russia gains access to this hill, they will have an overwatch position on the entire city of Avdiivka. And from this hill now, obviously, if Russia gains access to the hill, Ukraine more than likely will aim a ton of artillery at this hill. But that means that artillery won't be able to fire at other positions, right? So even if Ukraine denies Russia the use of this hill, taking the hill denies Ukraine the use of artillery at other locations. So it's a give and take. The hill is important for different reasons, right? Also, if Russia manages to get the hill, from that they have an excellent position to strike out at this suburban town right next to Avdiivka called Kladovice. So if Russia gains control of the hill, they can push into Kladovice, and if they gain access to Kladovice, then they are right outside of the city of Avdiivka. There's a small gully, I think you can see it at the edge of Kladovice, right between Kladovice and Avdiivka. And so if they can push over there, then they have a good spot to prepare a big push into the city itself. So very important that Ukraine denies Russia access to this hill, and very important that Ukraine holds the valley I pointed out before. And last but not least, let's take a look at the industrial zone southeast of Avdiivka, where the Russians have been pushing hard into the ruins and claiming Ukrainian trench lines. And Russia has steadily been advancing in this industrial zone, trying to reach the quarry, trying to gain access to all the factories. And the reason is they want to, if they hold the industrial zone, they can then push in more troops and push out into the forests here to the southeast of Avdiivka. And if they're in the forests, they have more cover, they can maneuver more easily without being spotted, since they don't have to cross the wide open fields. And if they have the forest, they can then start attacking Avdiivka from where the Russians find it the most advantageous. They don't have to follow windbreaks, they don't have to follow specific highways, they don't have to cross dangerous open farmland. So that is why the industrial site, the industrial zone is important. If Russia grabs it, they can then push out into forests, and if they have the forests, they can attack Avdiivka from multiple locations that could be very advantageous for the Russians. And the industrial zone, it's a mixed bag of bombed pieces, buildings and factory areas, and lots of trenches and lots of defensive positions, lots of bunkers and what have you. So basically what Ukraine needs to do is to hold on to what little they have left of the industrial zone, because if they lose that, then Russia can focus on pushing out into the forests. So Ukraine needs to hold on to these last remaining buildings that they have in the industrial zone, because if they manage to do that, they then can deny the Russians access to the forests. Then they can counter the Russians. Possibly, if they manage to reclaim territory in the industrial zone, then the Russians run the risk of being cut off if they prematurely push into the forests. So Ukraine needs to put in effort to holding these last remaining buildings that they are now in control of. A bit of a no-brainer, really. Hold on to the last buildings that you're in control of. But I mean, if Russia has full access of the industrial zone, then it's so much more difficult for Ukraine to defend this vast stretch of forests, right? Right now, the fight is in the industrial zone. The Russians want the industrial zone. So it's going to be easier to defend these buildings, because if the Russians begin to spread out into the forests, it becomes more of a traditional fight where Russian numbers could overwhelm Ukrainian positions. And why does the Russians want to get into the forest? Well, like I said, lots of cover, they can maneuver more freely, and also they will gain the high ground. The forest is growing atop high ground on hills, and the Russians can gain access to the hills and open fire into Avdiivka from the hills all over the place. So all these green patches, the forest here, that is high ground where the Russians can get an overwatch position looking out over the city of Avdiivka. So keeping the Russians away from these hills, away from these woods and forests is absolutely essential for the Ukrainian defense. Right, so that's what I have to say about Avdiivka. Now we're going to move on to a location south of Marinka. Marinka is a town that we've been hearing a lot about, where people news that Russia has pushed the Ukrainians out of Marinka after a year of fighting. And other sources say that Ukraine has pushed back in and stuff like that. But south of Marinka, there's a small town that has rarely been touched upon in reports, I feel. And that is the town of Novomykhailivka. And here we have the location of Novomykhailivka, south of Donetsk, south of the town of Marinka. Right, so on the leftmost map, we can see Marinka up in the north, and south of it, we have Novomykhailivka. And most of the reporting has been surrounding the Russian pushes within Marinka, but very little has been said, I feel, about Novomykhailivka and the importance of Novomykhailivka. So, Russia has been, for the better part of 2 months, been pushing towards Novomykhailivka from the south. And as you can see, they've been following, again, two valleys, two gullies, where there's cover. They don't need to worry about the wide open fields, where they can be sniped and easily targeted. The fight is happening in these valleys where there's cover, where they can maneuver, and where the both attackers and defenders are funneled, so it's easy to target enemy positions with mortars and what have you. And basically, it's the simplest thing. Ukraine needs to hold these two valleys. It's that simple. Russia has been pushing continuously, meter by meter, inch by inch, further into these two valleys, and they are closing in on Novomykhailivka steadily. And Ukraine needs to do what they can within these two narrow valleys to prevent that from happening. There's no other way to say it, really. And why is Novomykhailivka important? Well, take a look at this. Novomykhailivka is itself located in a valley where a river runs. And this river continues along a long ass valley with 10, 10 small towns and villages in it. So if Russia manages to push into Novomykhailivka, it's only 2 kilometers to the next town of Kostiantynivka and this small village in between called Paraskovivka. So if Russia pushes in here and starts moving along this river in this valley, they will be able to take a full string of towns, not in a day or two. This is, if it gets this far, it will take months, because that's how this war progresses. Nothing happens in a day, things happen in a month or two. And if, as they take each town, they can then extend their territory surrounding that town, expanding their control, possibly even linking up with forces up in Marinka, for instance, because if they've taken Marinka, they can push south along that highway and reach up with friendly forces in Kostiantynivka and what have you. So this is why I think Novomykhailivka is super important for the Ukrainians to hold, because if Russia gains access to this river, to this valley, then they have a clear objective of pushing along the river, taking one town after the other, and being a massive threat to Ukraine in the area. So, Novomykhailivka, far more important for Ukraine to hold this town than holding Marinka in the north, if you ask me. Thank you for watching. Hope I'll see you in the next one. Ukraine is doing its best, fighting like devils to hold on to the line, to not let the Russians advance, to fight to the bitter end in order to protect their loved ones from being violated, murdered, and kidnapped by the Russian state. So, all that said, gå på marsch, Ukraine, give them hell. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.